72 years old, first time flying. But what I just saw here. My granddaughter. Disappeared 12 years ago.
What I'm about to tell you changed my life forever. It was my first flight at 72 years old, and
My name is Eduardo Mendoza, and this is the story of how a flight changed not only my life, but that of my entire family in ways we could never have imagined. But to understand the magnitude of this journey, you must first know the hell we had lived through for 12 years. The day I found Isabella's letter was like the universe had decided to open wounds I thought had healed. I had been cleaning her room, something I did religiously every month since her disappearance, when my worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude fell from my hands. As I picked it up, a yellowed piece of paper slipped from between its pages. At first I didn't understand what it was, the childish handwriting, the spelling mistakes typical of a 6-year-old girl, but when I read my name at the end, my hands began to tremble violently. Isabella had known. She had known something terrible was going to happen to her and had tried to warn us, and we, blinded by daily routine, had not seen the signs. That letter became my obsession. I read it every night before sleep, memorizing every word, every uncertain stroke of her pencil. The man in the blue car. Why had she never told us about him? Why had Carmen dismissed her fears as childhood fantasies? And most disturbing of all, why had she mentioned a sister? The years following Isabella's disappearance had been a downward spiral of pain and family self-destruction. Carmen had suffered not one, but 3 nervous breakdowns. The first, 2 months after the disappearance, when they found a girl's body in the river, and for 6 terrible hours we thought it was Isabella. The second, after a year, when she realized the police had officially classified the case as human trafficking and had ceased active searching. The third, the most severe, when we reached 5 years without knowing anything about her. During that last breakdown, Carmen had attempted to take her own life. Roberto had found her in the bathroom, with slashed wrists and a photo of Isabella in her hand. She survived, but something in her broke forever. The following 2 years, she spent in and out of psychiatric institutions with medications that turned her into a ghostly version of the vibrant woman she had been. Roberto, my son-in-law, had dealt with grief differently but equally destructively. He had immersed himself in work, taking increasingly complex cases, working 18 hours a day to have no time to think. But he had also begun drinking, at first only at night, to be able to sleep. Then during lunch. Finally, he carried a flask in his suit pocket and drank at regular intervals throughout the day. His marriage to Carmen had become a silent battlefield. She blamed him for not having protected Isabella. He blamed her for not having paid attention to the signs. Both blamed themselves, but it was easier to direct anger at each other than to face the guilt that ate them from within. The last straw had been the discovery of Roberto's affair. Carmen had found text messages from a colleague, a young lawyer, who offered him the comfort and escape he could no longer find at home. It wasn't love. It was pure need to feel something other than pain. But for Carmen, it was the ultimate betrayal. I had stayed in the town, becoming the guardian of memories. I kept Isabella's room exactly as it was the day she disappeared. Her bed made, waiting. Her toys arranged. Her small clothes hanging in the closet as if she were going to return at any moment to put them on. The townspeople looked at me with a mixture of pity and respect. Poor Don Eduardo, they whispered when I passed through the square. He never recovered. But they were wrong. It wasn't that I hadn't recovered. It was that I had made my pain a vocation. Someone had to keep believing. Someone had to keep the flame of hope burning. The detectives had officially closed the case after 3 years. The last one, a tired man with eyes that had seen too much, had told me the truth without beating around the bush. Don Eduardo, in cases like this, when so much time passes, most likely the girl is dead, or she's been sold so far away that we'll never find her. My advice is to try to grieve and move on. But I couldn't grieve someone who continued to live in my dreams. Because Isabella visited me every night, not as a ghost, but as a living presence. I could feel her in the house, hear her laughter in the garden, see her shadow playing on the porch. The doctors said they were hallucinations caused by stress and depression, but I knew it was real. I knew that somewhere, Isabella was still alive and trying to communicate with me. That was what had kept my sanity intact for 12 years. The absolute and irrational certainty that my granddaughter was alive, and that someday she would find a way to return home. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday night, when a storm was battering the town and power outages had left my house in darkness. It was Carmen, but her voice sounded different. Not the broken and medicated voice she had developed in recent years, but something more desperate, more urgent. "Dad," she sobbed over the phone, "I need you to come. Please. Roberto and we're going to divorce officially. Tomorrow, we sign the papers." I sat heavily in my favorite chair, the same one where Isabella used to curl up with me to listen to stories. "Daughter, are you sure? Maybe with couples therapy." "No, Dad, it's over. He's going to move in with her." Her voice broke completely. "The lawyer he cheated on me with. They're going to live together. And I can't be alone here, in this city where everything reminds me of her. But I also can't return to the town. It's too much pain." There was a long pause, filled only with her crying. "Dad, I think I'm going to do something terrible if I stay alone. The thoughts are coming back, the thoughts about ending all this." My blood froze. Carmen had attempted suicide once. I couldn't allow her to reach that point again. "Listen to me, daughter. I'm coming there. I'll take the first flight I can find." "Flight? Dad, you've never flown. You're terrified of airplanes." It was true. Throughout my life, I had avoided flying, part irrational fear, part rural superstition. But in that moment, my terror of losing my daughter was greater than any phobia. "For you, I would do anything. Even fly to hell if necessary." That night, I didn't sleep. I spent the hours before dawn in Isabella's room, reading her letter over and over again. "If something happens to me, I want you to know that I love you very much, and that I'll always remember the stories you tell me." Had I also failed as a grandfather? Had I been so obsessed with keeping her memory alive that I had neglected her mother, who also needed my support? At dawn, I called the airline and bought a ticket for the afternoon flight. My hands trembled as I gave my credit card information. At 72 years old, I was about to do something I never thought I would do: fly. The airport was a sensory nightmare that overwhelmed me from the moment I walked through the automatic glass doors. The noise was deafening. Thousands of conversations in languages I didn't understand. Constant announcements over loudspeakers. The distant roar of airplane engines. The fluorescent lights created shadows that danced on the polished floor, and the smell of fuel mixed with food and cheap perfumes made me dizzy. I had never felt so out of place, so old, so lost. Entire families walked with the confident step of those who had done this hundreds of times. Executives with briefcases and urgent expressions talked on cell phones while running to their boarding gates. Young couples said goodbye with kisses and promises of daily calls. Each scene was a reminder of the life I had lost, of the family that had disintegrated, of the trips that Isabella and I would never take together. My flight was delayed 2 hours due to technical problems. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the waiting area, watching the planes take off and land through the huge windows. Every time I saw one rise into the sky, my stomach contracted with a mixture of terror and anticipation. It was then that I saw her. At first, I thought it was another of my hallucinations, a product of stress and lack of sleep. But there she was, next to the window overlooking the runway, a girl of approximately 12 years old, with chestnut wavy hair that shone under the artificial light of the airport. My heart stopped. She was identical to Isabella. Not similar, not alike. Identical. The same green eyes that seemed to contain all the mystery of the world, the same small upturned nose that wrinkled when she smiled, the same way of tilting her head when something captured her attention. She even had the same small mole on her left cheek, barely visible but which I knew like the lines of my own hand. I stood up so abruptly that the chair rocked dangerously. The cane slipped from my hands and fell to the floor with a metallic crash that made several people look at me with expressions of annoyance. I didn't care. Nothing existed in the world except that girl who could be my lost granddaughter. I walked toward her as if hypnotized, Each step an eternity, each meter an impossible mountain to climb. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, that I was seeing things, that 12 years of pain had driven me mad. But my heart knew the truth with a certainty that transcended all logic. The girl was absorbed, watching the planes rolling on the runway. She had a worn notebook in her hands and was drawing with the intense concentration that Isabella had always shown when creating her artwork. When I got close enough to see her drawing, I almost collapsed. It was an airplane, but not just any airplane. It was exactly the same type of airplane that Isabella had drawn hundreds of times during her first 6 years of life. A commercial plane with disproportionately large wings, round windows like eyes, and the same fluffy clouds around that looked like cotton candy. It even had the same smiling sun in the upper right corner, with rays extending like fingers toward the edges of the paper. "Excuse me," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse with emotion and barely audible above the airport noise. She looked up and smiled at me. That smile, my God, that smile was exactly the same one that had illuminated my house during the first 6 years of Isabella's life. The same tilt of the lips, the same mischievous gleam in her eyes, the same sweetness that could melt the coldest heart. "Hello, sir," she said with a voice that was heavenly music to my ears. "Do you like airplanes? I love them, although I've never flown in one." Her voice. It was exactly Isabella's voice, with the same musical cadence, the same way of pronouncing words. But there was something more, something that made me feel as if the ground was opening under my feet. She had the same accent from the town where we had lived, an accent that almost no one used anymore. I couldn't respond immediately. Tears had begun to flow, and my throat had closed completely. This girl didn't just look like Isabella. She was Isabella in all the ways that mattered. "What's your name, little one?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling like leaves on a tree in a storm. She looked at me with a strange expression, as if the question confused her deeply. Her eyes clouded for a moment, as if she were trying to remember something important she had forgotten. "My name is Luna," she responded slowly, but then added something that made my world real, although sometimes I feel that's not my real name. Sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I hear someone calling me something else. It's a man's voice, very soft, that says a name that feels like home. She brought a hand to her forehead, as if her head hurt. And sometimes I dream about places I've never visited. A small house with a garden full of flowers. An older man with a cane who tells me stories on a porch. A small furry dog called Canelo. My cane slipped from my hands for the second time. Canelo had been Isabella's dog, a cocker spaniel she adored, and who had died 2 years after her disappearance, as if he too had lost the will to live without her. "Where did you learn that name?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Luna replied, with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I don't understand why I know things I shouldn't know. I don't understand why sometimes I wake up crying and don't know why I'm sad." Before I could fully process what Luna had just told me, a woman appeared running toward us with an expression of absolute panic on her face. She was young, maybe 30 years old, with black hair pulled back in a ponytail that swayed violently as she ran. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the airport like those of a cornered animal looking for predators. "Luna, how many times have I told you not to talk to strangers?" she shouted, reaching us and grabbing the girl's arm with a force that seemed excessive to me. Her fingers left white marks on Luna's delicate skin. The girl automatically cringed, and I saw something in her eyes that broke my heart. Fear. A deep and familiar fear, the same I had seen in Isabella's eyes during the weeks before her disappearance, when she had begun having nightmares about the bad man who followed her. But there was something more disturbing in Luna's reaction. It wasn't just fear, it was resignation. As if she were accustomed to being treated this way, as if she had learned that resisting only made things worse. "I'm sorry, sir," the woman said, but her eyes avoided mine completely. "Luna is very sociable, but she shouldn't bother other passengers." There was something profoundly wrong with the entire situation. The way the woman held Luna, as if she were a valuable possession that someone could snatch away at any moment. The way her eyes constantly scanned the airport, stopping at every security uniform, every surveillance camera. And above all, the way Luna looked at her, not with the unconditional love of a daughter toward her mother, but with a fearful obedience that broke my soul. "No problem," I managed to say, although my voice trembled, betraying me. "I was just admiring her drawing. She draws very well for her age." Luna smiled shyly and showed me her notebook. My eyes filled with tears when I saw what she had been creating. Besides the airplane, she had drawn other things that hit me like punches to the stomach. A small house with a garden full of sunflowers. Isabella had planted sunflowers with me the last summer before disappearing. An older man with a cane sitting on a wooden porch, who looked exactly like me in my house, and what appeared to be a small, furry dog playing in the garden. But what impacted me most was the last drawing on the page, a girl identical to Luna, but with a sad expression, stretching her hand toward the sky, as if trying to reach something. And in the sky, another outstretched hand, trying to reach the first. "Where did you get the inspiration for these drawings?" I asked, desperately trying to keep my voice calm while my heart beat like a war drum. "I don't know," Luna replied, looking at her drawings with the same confusion she had shown before. "Sometimes, when I'm very calm, it's like my hands know what to draw without my head telling them. It's like someone else is guiding the pencil." The woman accompanying her became visibly more nervous. Her eyes moved faster and faster, and I noticed she had begun to sweat despite the airport's air conditioning. "Luna, don't bother the gentleman with your fantasies," she said with a voice that tried to sound maternal but sounded forced, like an actress who had forgotten her lines. "You know what we've talked about, making up stories." But I knew they weren't fantasies. I knew those drawings were windows to a life that Luna had lived, but that apparently had been erased from her conscious memory. Every line, every detail was too specific, too exact to be a product of imagination. "Where are you traveling to?" I asked, desperate to get more information before they disappeared forever. To visit some relatives," the woman replied evasively, gently tugging Luna's arm. "People we haven't seen in a long time." Her answer sounded rehearsed, as if she had repeated those same words hundreds of times. And I noticed something else. When she mentioned relatives, Luna frowned with confusion, as if she didn't know who the woman was talking about. "Come on, Luna," the woman continued, her voice now more urgent. "Our flight is about to board." As they walked away, Luna turned around and said something that would haunt me for the following months. "Sir, you remind me of someone. Someone who used to tell me stories before bed, and who smelled like tobacco and coffee. Do we know each other from somewhere?" I couldn't answer. Tears had completely blinded me, because I had been a smoker for 50 years before quitting when Isabella was born, and I had always drunk strong coffee in the mornings. It was exactly how she remembered me when she was little, as the grandfather who smelled like tobacco and coffee, and who told her stories. As I watched them disappear into the crowd, a voice in my head screamed that I had to do something, that I couldn't let Isabella disappear again, but my legs wouldn't respond. My entire body was paralyzed by the shock of what I had just experienced. It was only when I lost sight of Luna's chestnut hair in the crowd that I managed to move. I ran toward where I had last seen them, pushing other passengers, shouting her name, but she had disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed her. A security guard approached me. "Are you okay, sir? Do you need medical help?" "A girl," I managed to gasp. "A girl with chestnut hair and a woman. Did you see where they went?" The guard looked around, confused. "Sir, there are hundreds of girls and women in this airport. You'd have to be more specific." But how could I be specific? How could I explain that I had just seen my granddaughter, who had been lost for 12 years, in an airport hundreds of kilometers from home? How could I explain that the woman accompanying her clearly had her under some kind of control? "Nothing," I finally muttered. "Nothing. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. Nothing would be fine again until I knew the truth about Luna. The flight to the capital was the most torturous experience of my life, and it had nothing to do with my fear of flying. Every minute in the air was a minute further from Luna, a minute more in which she could disappear forever again. My mind couldn't process anything other than the absolute, irrational but unshakable certainty that I had found Isabella. During the 3 hours of flight, I reconstructed every second of the encounter in my mind. Every word Luna had said, every gesture, every expression, everything fit together too perfectly to be coincidence. The identical physical appearance, the unconscious gestures, the voice, the drawings showing places and people from Isabella's life, and even the way she had reacted to seeing me, with an instinctive familiarity that transcends conscious memory. But there was also the woman, her nervous behavior, the controlling and almost possessive way she treated Luna, the way she avoided direct questions, her eyes constantly alert, as if expecting to be discovered at any moment. Everything about her screamed that there was something hidden, something dark and dangerous. During the flight, I built and destroyed dozens of theories about what had happened. Maybe Isabella had been kidnapped and sold in the black market of adoptions. Maybe the woman was part of an international criminal network. Maybe they had used drugs or brainwashing techniques to erase Isabella's memories and create a new identity. The possibilities were infinite and all terrible. But there was something else that disturbed me. The connection Luna had shown with me, the way she had reacted to my presence, suggested that at some deep level she remembered me. Did that mean other memories were also there, buried but not destroyed? Upon landing in the capital, the first thing I did was call Roberto from the airport's public phone. My hands trembled so much I dialed the wrong number 3 times before managing to connect. "Roberto, it's me," I said when he finally answered. "I just landed, but listen carefully, because this is important. I think I saw Isabella at the airport." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear office background noise, phones ringing, distant conversations, computer typing. "Eduardo," he said finally, with that tired voice he had developed after years of false hopes and leads that led nowhere. "We've talked about this before. You can't keep seeing Isabella in every girl who remotely resembles her. It's not healthy for you, and it's torture for Carmen every time you give her false hope. No, Roberto, this time is different. This girl didn't just look like Isabella. She was identical, and she knew things, had drawn things that only Isabella could know. Our house, Canelo, my routine of telling her stories." Another long pause. I could hear Carmen in the background, asking anxiously what was happening. "Okay, Eduardo, when you get home we'll talk calmly. But please, for the love of God, don't get your hopes up. We can't go through that again. Carmen can't go through that again." But I knew this time was different. This time it wasn't imagination or wishful thinking. This time it was real, and I wasn't going to rest until I proved the truth. The house where Carmen and Roberto lived in the capital was a perfect reflection of their marriage. Modern, functional, but completely cold. Everything was gray and white, without a single family photograph on the walls, without memories of happier times. It was as if they had decided to erase their past to be able to survive the present. Carmen had aged more than she should have in 5 years. Her hair, once bright chestnut like Isabella's, was now completely gray. Her eyes, which had once been vivacious and full of joy, now seemed extinguished, as if they had seen too much pain for one lifetime. She had lost weight to the point of appearing fragile, and had that characteristic pallor of someone who spends too much time indoors. Roberto was equally changed. His expensive suit couldn't hide the deep dark circles under his eyes, the stress lines around his eyes, or the slight tremor in his hands that revealed his dependence on alcohol. When he hugged me at the airport, I could smell whiskey on his breath despite it being midday. Dinner that night was an exercise in avoiding painful topics. We talked about the weather, my trip, changes in the town, but the tension was palpable. Carmen barely touched her food, pushing it around the plate while avoiding eye contact. Roberto drank 3 glasses of wine during dinner, and then excused himself to work a little in his study, where I knew he had a hidden bottle. It was only when we were alone that Carmen finally broke down. "Dad," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I don't know what to do. Roberto's going to sign the divorce papers tomorrow. He's already found an apartment to move in with her." She was referring to the lawyer Roberto had been having an affair with for the past 2 years. a young woman named Monica, who worked at his firm and who offered him escape from pain he could no longer find at home. And the worst thing is I can't blame him, Carmen continued. I'm a ghost, Dad. I've been dead and walking for years. I haven't been a wife. I haven't been a real mother since we lost Isabella. I've just been walking pain. She collapsed on the sofa, sobbing with an intensity that broke my heart. Sometimes I think it would be better if I simply disappeared too. At least then the pain would end. The words froze my blood. Carmen had attempted suicide once before, and I recognized the warning signs. Daughter, look at me, I said, taking her trembling hands. Listen carefully, because what I'm going to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me. And then I told her everything, every detail of the encounter at the airport, Luna's identical appearance, her drawings, her words about dreams and memories she couldn't explain, the way she had recognized me instinctively, the nervous woman who clearly controlled her. At first, Carmen listened to me with the tired skepticism of someone who had heard too many unfounded theories for 12 years. But when I described the drawings in detail, when I mentioned the mole on Luna's cheek, when I repeated word for word what she had said about someone who told her stories and smelled like tobacco and coffee, I saw something I hadn't seen in my daughter's eyes in years. Hope. Dad, she whispered, her voice broken. Are you really sure? Do you really think it was her? Daughter, I've lived 12 years with the pain of having lost her. I've seen her face in my dreams every night. I know every one of her gestures, every expression, every inflection of her voice. It was her. I'm absolutely sure. Roberto had returned from his work and had heard the last part of our conversation. His expression was a mixture of skepticism and desperation. Eduardo, I understand you want to believe, but… Roberto, I interrupted firmly. I know I sound like a crazy old man, clinging to impossible hopes, but I need you to listen to me. I need you to use your contacts, your legal resources. Help me investigate this. If I'm wrong, I accept the truth and finally grieve. But if I'm right… Carmen had stood up and was pacing the room like a caged tiger. If you're right, she said with a voice I hadn't heard in years, then we've lost 12 additional years for not searching enough. Roberto, despite his skepticism, was a successful lawyer with contacts throughout the city. That same night, he began making calls. He contacted private investigators, spoke with former colleagues in the police, mobilized all the resources he had available. The first step was to obtain flight information from the airport on the day I had seen Luna. Roberto had a friend in airport administration who owed him favors, and although taking that information was technically illegal, he managed to get a list of all outgoing flights that day with their destinations. The following days were an emotional roller coaster. Every phone call could bring news that would change our lives forever, or that would definitively destroy our renewed hopes. Carmen couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. She spent hours walking through the house like a ghost, murmuring Isabella's name and clinging to every small update. Meanwhile, I couldn't get one question that tormented me out of my head. Why had Luna mentioned a sister? In the letter Isabella had written before disappearing, she had mentioned that the man in the blue car had told her he knew her sister. Was it possible there was more to this story than we had imagined? On the third day of investigation, Roberto received a call that changed everything. It was her, he told me, entering the room with tears rolling down his cheeks. We found her. The girl you saw is called Luna Hernandez, and she's been living with a woman named Sandra Morales for the past 8 years. Carmen screamed and collapsed on the sofa, covering her face with her hands. But Eduardo, Roberto continued, there's something else, something that complicates all this enormously. The story that emerged during the following weeks was more complex and disturbing than we could ever have imagined. Sandra Morales was not a common criminal operating in human trafficking networks. She was a woman who had lost her own daughter in a car accident and who had suffered a complete psychotic breakdown that led her to believe she could save other girls by giving them a new life. But here, the complications began. According to the records Roberto had managed to obtain, Isabella had been kidnapped, yes, but not by Sandra. She had been kidnapped by a man named Carlos Vega, who worked for a network of child trafficking that operated on the border. Isabella had been sold through this network to a family in another country. However, during transport, there had been an accident. The vehicle transporting Isabella and two other girls had overturned on a rural road. Isabella had been severely injured and taken to a small hospital in a border town where she had remained in a coma for 3 weeks. It was in that hospital where Sandra, who worked as a volunteer nurse after her own daughter's death, had met Isabella. When the girl awoke from the coma, she had completely lost her memory due to brain trauma. She didn't remember her name, her family, nothing from her previous life. Sandra, in her disturbed mental state, had seen this as a divine sign. She had falsified adoption documents, bribed a doctor to declare that Isabella had died in the hospital, and had taken the girl with her, giving her the name Luna. During the first years after the rescue, Sandra had kept Isabella completely isolated, convincing her that she had been abandoned by her previous family, that Sandra was her biological mother who had saved her from a terrible life. But Isabella, even with her damaged memory, had never completely believed these stories. Deep in her mind, fragments of real memories remained, manifesting in dreams and drawings. The most disturbing thing of all was that Sandra genuinely loved the girl she now called Luna. For 8 years, she had been a devoted mother, though deeply disturbed. She had cared for Isabella when she was sick, comforted her during nightmares, taught her to read and write. In her twisted mind, she had been giving Isabella the life she deserved. But the weight of maintaining the lie for so many years had begun to severely affect Sandra's mental health. The investigators discovered that in recent months she had been acting increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone would come to take Luna away. That's why they had been traveling constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few months. When we were beginning to make real progress in the investigation, we ran into an unexpected obstacle. The original detective who had handled Isabella's disappearance case, a man named Raul Mendoza, no family relation, had been deliberately sabotaging the investigation from the beginning. Roberto discovered this when he tried to access the official case files. Several important documents had disappeared, witness testimonies had never been properly recorded, and promising leads had been abandoned without explanation. The truth was that Mendoza had been receiving payments from the child trafficking network to protect them from police investigations. When Isabella had disappeared, he had been assigned to the case specifically to ensure it was never solved. He had fed our family false hopes while systematically destroying any evidence that could lead to the truth. But when Sandra had rescued Isabella from the hospital, she had inadvertently broken the criminal network's chain of custody. Isabella was no longer where she was supposed to be, and this had caused significant problems for the organization. Mendoza had been searching for Isabella for years, not to reunite her with her family, but to eliminate the only living witness who could connect the network to dozens of other kidnappings. This discovery added a new dimension of urgency to our search. We weren't just trying to reunite our family, we were racing against time to protect Isabella from dangerous forces that wanted to silence her forever. Roberto immediately contacted the FBI. Police corruption combined with international child trafficking had elevated the case to federal level. The agents who took the case were experienced professionals, but even they admitted the situation was extraordinarily complex. Meanwhile, Carmen had taken indefinite leave from her job and had dedicated herself completely to the search. For the first time in years, she had a purpose, something to live for. She had stopped taking the antidepressants and tranquilizers that had kept her in a semi-vegetative state for years, and the strong and determined woman she had been before the tragedy was emerging again. But time was running against us. Federal agents had discovered that Sandra had been receiving threatening calls in recent weeks. Someone had discovered where she was and was pressuring her to hand over Luna. The calls increased in frequency and intensity, and Sandra had begun acting increasingly erratically. It was then that we received the news we had been fearing. Sandra and Luna had disappeared again. The last time anyone had seen them was at a bus station in a border city, buying tickets to a destination the seller couldn't remember. Sandra had paid in cash and used false documents. Federal agents deployed all their resources, They put alerts at airports, train stations, and border crossings. They distributed photographs of Sandra and Luna to all police departments within a 500-kilometer radius. But it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Carmen panicked. After having recovered hope for the first time in years, the possibility of losing Isabella again was destroying her. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and began talking about following Isabella to the other side if they couldn't find her. Roberto, facing the possible definitive loss of his daughter and his wife's imminent self-destruction, made a desperate decision. He canceled his divorce, ended his relationship with Monica, and dedicated himself completely to the search. He hired additional private investigators, offered a $50,000 reward for information, and pressured all his political contacts to keep the case as maximum priority. While we struggled against time, a new complicator entered the scene. An investigative journalist named Marcos Herrera had heard rumors about the case and had begun his own investigation. Herrera had a reputation for exposés that destroyed careers and ruined lives, and had smelled a story that could make him famous. Herrera began pressuring our family for exclusive interviews, threatening to publish the story with or without our cooperation. He argued that media exposure could help find Isabella, but federal agents warned him that premature publicity could put Isabella in greater danger. The journalist didn't listen to the warnings. He began publishing sensationalist articles that revealed investigation details, exposed police corruption, and put our family tragedy on the front page. National media picked up the story, and soon our private search became a media circus. The media attention had unexpected consequences. On one hand, it generated hundreds of tips from people who believed they had seen Sandra and Luna. On the other hand, it alerted the criminal network that authorities were close to discovering their entire operation. It was in this media chaos that we received a call that would change everything. It was Sandra. She had somehow gotten our phone number and had called in a state of absolute panic. Her voice trembled so much that at first we couldn't understand what she was saying. "Please," she sobbed over the phone. "I don't know what to do. They want her. They say if I don't give her to them, they're going to kill us both." Carmen had taken the phone with trembling hands. "Where is my daughter? Where is Isabella?" "She's not called Isabella," Sandra screamed hysterically. "Her name is Luna. She's my daughter. I saved her." But then her voice broke completely. But she asks about you. Every night she asks about the grandfather who smelled like tobacco and told stories. She asks about the mom who sang lullabies. She asks about the house with the sunflower garden." Federal agents had been tracing the call, but Sandra ended it before they could locate her exact origin. However, they had managed to determine she was somewhere on the coast, probably in a cheap hotel or motel. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through Roberto and Carmen's house, remembering Sandra's words. Despite everything she had done, despite the pain she had caused, it was clear she genuinely loved Isabella. She had been a mother to her for 8 years, and the idea of handing her over to criminals who could hurt her was destroying her. I also realized something else. Isabella was remembering. The memory fragments she had kept buried for years were emerging, and she was asking about us. After all this time, our little girl was trying to find her way back home. While we waited for more news from Sandra, federal agents had been investigating the medical records from the hospital where Isabella had been in a coma. What they discovered added a new dimension to the entire story. Isabella hadn't completely lost her memory due to brain trauma. Doctors had discovered evidence that she had been systematically drugged with substances that caused temporary amnesia. Someone had been deliberately erasing her memories, but the effect hadn't been permanent. More disturbing still, they had found evidence that Isabella wasn't the only victim. During the past 10 years, there had been dozens of similar cases. Children who disappeared, appeared in hospitals with brain trauma and amnesia, and then disappeared again before authorities could investigate properly. Dr. Patricia Ruiz, a brain trauma specialist who had reviewed Isabella's medical files, explained that the type of amnesia she had suffered was consistent with prolonged use of experimental drugs that had been developed during classified military research projects decades earlier. "What they did to your granddaughter," she told us during a video conference, was essentially psychological torture designed to erase her identity and create a new personality. It's a miracle she retained any memories of her previous life. This revelation fundamentally changed our understanding of what Isabella had suffered. She hadn't simply been kidnapped, she had been subjected to a systematic form of psychological abuse designed to destroy her sense of self. Carmen broke down completely when she heard this. The idea that her little daughter had been tortured this way was more than she could bear. Roberto had to literally carry her out of the room while she sobbed uncontrollably. It was during this emotional crisis that Maria Elena Sanchez appeared in our lives. She was the retired social worker I had mentioned before, but there was more to her story than she had initially revealed. Maria Elena had been following Isabella's case for years, not just out of professional interest, but because she had been involved in another related case, that of Luna Hernandez, a girl who had been abandoned in a hospital and had disappeared with Sandra. What I never told you, Maria Elena explained during our second meeting, is that I had suspicions about the connection between Isabella and Luna for years. There's something about the dates, the circumstances, the physical similarities, too many coincidences. She pulled out a thick folder full of documents and photographs. 6 years ago, I hired a private investigator to look into Luna's background. What he discovered kept me awake for weeks. The photographs she showed us were shocking. Luna, at 4 years old, was absolutely identical to Isabella at the same age. Not just similar, identical, down to the last detail. But there's more, Maria Elena continued. The investigator managed to trace the original birth records. Isabella and Luna were born in the same hospital, just 6 hours apart, from a woman named Rosa Mendoza. My blood froze hearing that surname. Rosa Mendoza? I managed to whisper. Yes, and according to the records, she lists her father as Eduardo Mendoza, unknown residence. The world stopped. Carmen, Roberto, and I looked at each other in complete shock. That means, Carmen began. That means you, Don Eduardo, are the biological grandfather of both girls. Isabella and Luna are twin sisters, and Rosa was your biological daughter. The revelation that Rosa was my biological daughter opened a Pandora's box of family secrets I had kept buried for more than 30 years. Rosa had been the product of an affair I had during a difficult period in my marriage with Elena, Isabella's grandmother. It had been a moment of weakness, a night of alcohol and loneliness, with a young woman who worked in the town market. When Rosa was born, her mother had contacted me, but I was terrified of the consequences. Elena had just become pregnant with Carmen, our marriage was mending, and the revelation of my infidelity would have destroyed everything. I made the cowardly decision to deny my paternity and disappear from Rosa and her mother's lives. For years, I had lived with the guilt of having abandoned my biological daughter. I had sent money anonymously when I could, kept tabs from a distance, but had never had the courage to reveal the truth. Rosa had grown up in poverty, without a father, struggling to survive. She had gotten involved with drugs from an early age, had several pregnancies, and had lived on the streets for most of her adult life. When she had given birth to the twins, she had been so drugged she was barely conscious of what was happening. She had registered only one of the girls before disappearing from the hospital, leaving the other in the state care system. The cruel irony was that Carmen had been raising her half-sister without knowing it. Isabella and Luna weren't just twins. They were the granddaughters I never knew I had, daughters of the daughter I had abandoned. Carmen was furious when I told her the truth. Years of pain, years of searching, years of believing she had failed as a mother, and it all traced back to my cowardice from decades earlier. You could have prevented all this, she screamed, with more anger than I had seen in her in years. If you had been man enough to admit Rosa was your daughter, you could have helped. The twins would never have ended up in that situation. She was right, and the guilt was destroying me. But there was no time for recriminations. We had to find Isabella and Luna before it was too late. Federal agents had been working with psychological profiling experts to better understand Sandra's mental state. Their conclusion was that she was on the verge of complete collapse, torn between her genuine love for Luna and her terror of the criminals who threatened her. They decided to use this to their advantage. they would make it appear that the criminal network had been arrested, eliminating the threat that kept Sandra running. Then, they hoped she would emerge from hiding to seek medical help for Luna, who, according to medical reports they had obtained, was showing symptoms of extreme stress. The plan worked partially. Sandra did appear at a hospital in a coastal city, seeking psychological treatment for Luna. But when agents arrived at the hospital, they discovered the situation was more complicated than they had anticipated. Sandra had been telling Luna the truth during the past weeks. She had told her about her biological family, about the grandfather who was looking for her, about the mother who had never stopped loving her. Luna was emotionally devastated, torn between the only mother she remembered and the biological family she was beginning to remember. When agents arrived, Luna clung to Sandra, screaming that she didn't want to be separated from the only mother she knew. Sandra, for her part, begged to be allowed to maintain contact with Luna, insisting she had been a good mother despite the circumstances. The scene was heartbreaking for everyone involved. The day I finally saw Isabella Luna, again, was the most beautiful and painful day of my life. She was in a specialized care center, under intensive psychological care while experts evaluated the best way to handle her transition. When I entered the room where she was waiting, she looked up from the book she was reading and stared at me for long seconds. I could see recognition struggling to emerge in her eyes, like she was trying to assemble a puzzle with pieces that had been lost for years. "Grandpa Eduardo?" she finally whispered, and that word felt like a divine caress after 12 years of silence. I ran to her and hugged her with a force that contained all the desperation, all the love, all the hope I had accumulated for more than a decade. She clung to me as if I were a lifeline in an ocean of confusion. "I knew you would come," she told me through tears. "In my dreams, I always knew you would come looking for me." But the reunion wasn't the joyful celebration we had imagined. Isabella was deeply traumatized, not only by the original kidnapping, but by years of psychological manipulation, and by the recent revelation that her entire life had been a lie. She was angry with us for having abandoned her, despite rationally understanding that we had been victims too. She was angry with Sandra for having lied to her, but also missed her desperately because she had been the only constant maternal figure in her life. And she was terrified about her future, not knowing where she belonged or who she really was. While Isabella struggled with her identity, we fought in the courts. Sandra had been arrested, but her defense lawyer argued she had acted with the best intention of protecting an abandoned child. He asked for clemency based on her mental state and the fact that she had genuinely been a good mother to Isabella for 8 years. At the same time, we had to legally establish that Isabella was really our granddaughter. Years of falsified documents, lost records, and changed identities had created a legal maze that seemed impossible to navigate. Social services were concerned about Isabella's well-being. She had been with Sandra for more years than she had been with us, and her loyalty was divided. Psychologists recommended a gradual transition instead of an abrupt separation. But there was an additional complication. We still hadn't found Luna, Isabella's true twin sister. While Isabella slowly adapted to being back with us, we had begun the search for Luna. Adoption records had been falsified or destroyed, and tracing her whereabouts after so many years seemed impossible. It was Isabella who provided the crucial clue. During a therapy session, she mentioned that in her dreams she had always felt a presence, another girl who was looking for something. She described specific places: a foster family in a poor neighborhood, a school with a particular playground. Investigators followed these clues and eventually found Luna in a group foster home, where she had been living since her last adoptive parents had died in a workplace accident 2 years earlier. Luna had grown up feeling the same inexplicable connection that Isabella had described. She had been drawing the same places, dreaming about the same family, feeling that an important part of her was lost somewhere. When we showed her photographs of Isabella, Luna began to cry. "She's the girl from my dreams," she whispered. "Is she real? Does she really exist?" The day Isabella and Luna saw each other for the first time consciously as sisters was magical and heartbreaking at the same time. They recognized each other immediately, not only physically but at a deep level that went beyond appearance. "It's you," Luna whispered when she saw Isabella. "You're the girl who was always trying to reach out in my dreams." "And you're my other half," Isabella replied, taking Luna's hands. They hugged and cried together, releasing years of confusion, pain, and unconscious searching. Carmen and I cried too, but these were tears of joy, relief, completion. But the reunion also brought new challenges. Luna had grown up in poverty, moving from home to home, without the stability that Sandra had provided Isabella. She was more reserved, more distrustful, more damaged by years of neglect. There were also inevitable jealousies. Luna felt that Isabella had had a family that looked for her, while she had been truly abandoned. Isabella felt that Luna had had a more normal childhood, without the psychological manipulation she had suffered. The months that followed were of slow and complicated healing. Both Isabella and Luna needed intensive therapy, not only to process their individual traumas, but to learn to be sisters after having been separated their entire conscious lives. Carmen flourished like I had never seen her since Isabella's childhood. Having not only her daughter back, but also discovering she had a second daughter she had never known, gave her a reason to live that she had lost years ago. She dedicated herself completely to helping both girls heal and adapt. Roberto also changed profoundly. The process of finding Isabella had forced him to face his own demons, his alcoholism, his infidelity, his inability to deal with pain. He entered a recovery program, definitively ended his relationship with Monica, and dedicated himself to rebuilding his marriage and family. I, at 73 years old, rediscovered happiness, but also had to face the consequences of my past actions. The revelation about Rosa, my abandoned daughter, had created waves that affected the entire family. Carmen eventually forgave me, understanding that I too had been young and made mistakes. But trust took a long time to rebuild. One of the most difficult decisions we had to face was what to do with Sandra. Legally, she had committed kidnapping, document falsification, and obstruction of justice. But the emotional reality was much more complex. Isabella visited Sandra in prison regularly. Despite everything, Sandra had been her mother during 8 formative years, and completely breaking that connection would have been cruel and unnecessary. During the trial, Isabella testified in favor of Sandra, describing how she had been cared for and loved, even in impossible circumstances. Her testimony was heartbreaking. "I know what Sandra did was wrong," she said before the court. "I know she took me away from my real family. But I also know she saved my life when I was in the hospital, that she took care of me when I was sick, that she comforted me when I had nightmares. She's not an evil criminal. She's a sick woman who lost her own daughter and tried to fill that void the only way she knew how." The judge, moved by the testimony and by psychological evaluations that confirmed Sandra's fragile mental state, sentenced her to 5 years in prison with possibility of parole after 2 years, conditional on continued psychiatric treatment. While our family healed, the federal investigation had uncovered the complete network of corruption and child trafficking. Detective Raul Mendoza was arrested along with 15 other corrupt officers and criminal network members. During his interrogation, Mendoza revealed horrific details about the operation. For more than a decade, they had been kidnapping children from poor or dysfunctional families, using mind control methods to erase their identities, and selling them to wealthy families who couldn't adopt through legal means. Isabella had been a victim, but also a survivor. Her natural resistance to mind control drugs, combined with her strong family connection, had kept fragments of her true identity intact. Mendoza was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. During his final statement, looking directly at me, he said, "If I had known how persistent you would be, old man, I would have found another way to handle the case." His confession also revealed the location of other missing children. During the following months, dozens of families were reunited with children they had given up for dead years earlier. Marcos Herrera, the journalist who had sensationalized our story, eventually won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigation into the child trafficking network. But his invasion of our privacy during the most vulnerable moments had lasting consequences. Isabella and Luna had been photographed without permission, their personal stories had been exposed without their consent, and they had to deal with unwanted media attention for months. Herrera eventually tried to apologize, arguing that his work had led to the arrest of criminals and the rescue of other children. But Carmen forbade any future contact with our family, and we declined to participate in the book he wrote about the case. One of the biggest challenges we faced was the educational reintegration of Isabella and Luna. Isabella had received inconsistent education during her years with Sandra and had significant gaps in her academic knowledge. Luna had changed schools so many times she was also academically behind. But more difficult than academic challenges were social ones. Other students had seen their stories in the news, and there were constant rumors, bullying, and unwanted attention. Some children treated them like celebrities, others like freaks, and few treated them like normal girls. We had to change schools 3 times before finding a small private institution that had experience working with traumatized children. There, for the first time, Isabella and Luna could begin developing normal friendships and experiencing the childhood they had missed. As Isabella and Luna settled into their new life, mental health problems the doctors had been fearing began to manifest. Both girls developed post-traumatic stress disorder, with frequent nightmares, panic attacks, and dissociative episodes. Isabella had flashbacks to her years in captivity, particularly of the medical procedures she had been subjected to erase her memory. Luna had episodes of severe depression when faced with the reality that she had been genuinely abandoned by her biological mother. But most concerning was that both had inherited tendencies toward mental illness from their biological mother, Rosa. Doctors explained there were genetic components in personality disorders and addictive tendencies, and that the trauma they had experienced could activate these predispositions. We had to develop a complex treatment regimen that included individual therapy, family therapy, carefully monitored medication, and specialized techniques for treating complex childhood trauma. After a year in the capital, we made the decision to return to the town where Isabella had been born. Carmen and Roberto bought the house next to mine, and for the first time in more than a decade, the neighborhood was filled with children's voices again. But the return wasn't easy. The town had followed our story in the news, and there were divided opinions about us. Some people received us as heroes who had never lost hope. Others saw us as a circus attraction, constantly pointing and whispering when we passed on the street. Isabella had particular difficulty returning to places that triggered traumatic memories. The park where she had been kidnapped caused her severe panic attacks. The school where she had studied during her first years made her feel like she was living in a museum of her own life. Luna, on the other hand, found comfort in finally being in the places she had been seeing in dreams for years. For her, the town represented the home she had never had, the stability she had been seeking her entire life. During one of the routine medical checkups, doctors made a discovery that explained the extraordinary psychic connection between Isabella and Luna. Both had an extremely rare neurological condition called twin neural entanglement, which affects less than 1 in 10 million identical twins. This condition had created atypical neurological connections between their brains, allowing them to share sensations, emotions, and sometimes even thoughts. It was the scientific explanation behind the shared dreams, identical drawings, and the way they had been unconsciously searching for each other for years. But the condition also came with risks. Doctors explained that extreme stress in one twin could cause physical symptoms in the other, and that prolonged separations could cause progressive neurological deterioration in both. This revelation added a new dimension to their healing process. They not only had to learn to be sisters, they had to learn to manage a connection that was literally part of their biology. As Isabella and Luna entered adolescence, they faced new challenges. Their story had made them different from other teenagers, and they struggled with identity issues that went beyond normal adolescent problems. Isabella, now 15, had developed a strong but cautious personality. She was academically brilliant, but socially reserved, preferring small groups of close friends to large social gatherings. She had decided to use her experience to help others, expressing interest in studying psychology or social work. Luna, on the contrary, was more extroverted but emotionally volatile. She had developed some risky behaviors, experimenting with alcohol and occasionally skipping classes. Her therapist explained this was common in adolescents who had experienced early abandonment. They tended to sabotage stable relationships before others could abandon them. Tensions between the sisters had also evolved. They were no longer the traumatized children who desperately clung to each other. Now they were individual teenagers with distinct personalities, and sometimes they clashed like any normal sisters. After serving 2 years in prison, Sandra was released on parole. She had been receiving intensive psychiatric treatment and had shown significant improvements in her mental state. Isabella had been writing letters to her regularly during her incarceration, and when Sandra was released, she asked permission to visit her. Carmen initially opposed, but therapists argued that Isabella needed to close this chapter of her life in a healthy way. The meeting was emotional for everyone involved. Sandra had transformed during her time in prison. She had lost weight, looked older, and had a deep sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I know I can't undo what I did," she told Isabella during their first visit. "I know I took years away from you with your real family. But I want you to know that every day I spent with you was real. My love for you was real, even if everything else was a lie." Isabella, now old enough to understand the complexities of the situation, responded with a maturity that surprised me. "I don't hate what you did, Sandra. I'm sad about it, but I don't hate it, because you taught me that love can exist even in impossible situations." Sandra settled in a nearby city, working at a rehabilitation center for women with mental health problems. Isabella visited her once a month, and gradually they developed a new relationship. Not mother and daughter, but not strangers either. Something unique that worked for both. 3 years after the reunion, when it seemed our lives had finally found stable balance, we received a call that would change everything again. It was from Dr. Patricia Ruiz, the brain trauma specialist who had been following Isabella's case. Her voice trembled with barely contained excitement. "Eduardo, I need you to come to the hospital immediately. Isabella, Luna, Carmen, Roberto, everyone. There's something you need to know, something that's going to change the entire narrative of this story." We arrived at the hospital in a state of panic, fearing there was some new medical problem. But Dr. Ruiz received us with a smile she couldn't suppress. "For the past 3 years, I've been investigating Isabella's medical files more deeply," she began. "Specifically, I've been analyzing the blood samples they took when she was in a coma at that border hospital." She pulled out a thick folder full of laboratory reports. The drugs they used on Isabella were experimental, developed as part of a classified medical research program that was canceled decades ago. But here's what's fascinating. Those drugs didn't just erase memories. They also temporarily altered the neurological structure of the brain. We didn't understand where this was heading. What I'm trying to say is that Isabella wasn't born with twin neural entanglement condition. That condition was artificially created by the experimental drugs. Carmen went pale. "What does that mean?" "It means Isabella and Luna are not biological twin sisters. They're half-sisters, born 6 hours apart from the same mother, but from different fathers." The silence in the room was deafening. But the drugs altered Isabella's neurological structure in such a way that they created an artificial connection with Luna. The shared experiences, the dreams, the drawings. Everything was real, but it wasn't biological. It was the result of accidental neurological modification. Roberto was the first to speak. "But how is it possible they look so identical if they're not twins?" "Here's the most incredible twist of all," said Dr. Seat. Ruiz, with tears in her eyes. "After investigating Rosa's background more deeply, I discovered she herself was a twin. She had an identical twin sister named Mercedes who died in infancy." She pulled out more documents. Rosa had relationships with 2 different men during the same period. Eduardo, Isabella's father, and a man named Miguel Santos, Luna's father. But because Rosa was an identical twin, and due to genetic quirks, Isabella inherited mainly the genes from Rosa that came from her twin side, while Luna inherited genes from the other side. In simple terms, Isabella and Luna look identical because they both inherited the appearance of identical twins who were never born. They're genetic cousins who look like twins, artificially connected by experimental drugs, raised separately but always feeling each other's presence. The search for Luna's biological father, Miguel Santos, became our next obsession. Investigators finally located him living in a small town 2 hours away, working as a mechanic, and completely ignorant of the fact he had a daughter. Miguel had had a brief relationship with Rosa more than 15 years earlier. He remembered a beautiful but deeply troubled woman who had disappeared from his life as quickly as she had appeared. He had never known she had become pregnant. When we showed him photographs of Luna, he collapsed in a chair in his workshop. "My God," he whispered. "She looks exactly like my sister when she was a child." Miguel was a simple but good man who had lived a quiet life after overcoming his own problems with alcohol in his youth. He was married to a woman named Patricia, and they had 2 teenage children, Luna's half-siblings she had never known. The meeting between Miguel and Luna was emotional but complicated. Luna had spent her entire life feeling abandoned, and suddenly discovering she had a father who had never known of her existence challenged all her conceptions about her personal history. Miguel immediately wanted to be part of Luna's life, but she resisted. After years of abandonments and disappointments, she wasn't ready to trust another father figure who appeared suddenly. The revelation that Isabella and Luna were not biological twins, but genetic cousins with an artificial neurological connection changed the dynamics of our entire extended family. Isabella initially felt liberated. The pressure of being the lost twin had been intense, and discovering that her connection with Luna was unique but not biologically determined gave her a sense of individuality she had never had. Luna, on the contrary, felt devastated. The twin connection had been the only thing that had made her feel special, unique, important. Discovering that even that had been artificial reinforced her feelings of abandonment and artificiality. Carmen struggled with guilt for having automatically assumed Luna was her daughter. She had developed genuine love for Luna during the past 3 years, but now wondered if that love had been based on a lie. Miguel and his family wanted Luna to move in with them, arguing she had the right to know her biological siblings and experience a normal family life. But Luna had found stability with us. Despite the revelation about her origins, we were the family that had searched for her, that had found her, that had loved her unconditionally. After months of intensive family therapy and painful conversations, Luna made a decision that surprised everyone. She decided to maintain relationships with both families, but stay living primarily with us. She explained her decision in a letter she read to the entire extended family. "All my life, I've searched for a place where I belong. When I discovered Isabella was my twin, I thought I had finally found my place. When I discovered we weren't biological twins, I thought I had lost my place again. But I've learned something important. Family isn't just about genes or blood. It's about who searches for you when you're lost. It's about who loves you when you have nothing to offer in return. It's about who stays with you during the most difficult moments. Miguel is my biological father, and I want to know him and form a relationship with him and my siblings. But Eduardo, Carmen, and Roberto are my chosen family. They searched for me when no one else knew I existed. They loved me before knowing I wasn't biologically theirs. And Isabella isn't my biological twin, but she's my sister in all the ways that matter. We've shared dreams, pain, healing. That connection is real, no matter how it was created." The following years were of slow but constant growth. Isabella and Luna developed a unique sister relationship that wasn't defined by genes but by shared experiences and mutual love. Isabella graduated from high school as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to study psychology at university. She had decided to specialize in childhood trauma and family therapy, with the goal of helping other families who had experienced similar tragedies. Luna had a more difficult path. Her abandonment issues and tendencies toward self-destructive behaviors required intensive therapy for several years. But gradually, with constant support from both families, she found her balance. Carmen and Roberto renewed their wedding vows in a small ceremony in our garden 5 years after the reunion. Their marriage had been strengthened by the crisis, and they had learned to communicate and support each other in ways they had never achieved before. Miguel became a regular presence in our lives. He and Patricia visited regularly, and Luna spent summers and vacations with her biological family. Her half-siblings immediately adopted her, and Luna finally experienced what it was like to have normal siblings to fight with over trivial things. Sandra continued her recovery and eventually became an advocate for mental health system reform. She wrote a book about her experience, donating all proceeds to organizations that help women who have lost children. 5 years after the incredible reunion, we decided to take a special trip. Isabella and Luna, now 18, wanted to return to the airport where destiny had begun, weaving the threads that had brought us together as a family. As we walked through the airport corridors, Isabella and Luna hand in hand, I couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary journey we had shared. It had begun with a terrifying flight into the unknown, and had ended with the understanding that family is much more complex and beautiful than we could ever have imagined. In the same waiting area where I had first seen Luna, we sat as a family. Isabella and Luna had brought their sketchbooks, just like Luna had done years earlier, but now they drew together, creating collaborative art that reflected their unique connection. Carmen and Roberto were planning to officially adopt Luna after she turned 18, not because it was legally necessary, but because they wanted to make a formal declaration that she was their chosen daughter. Miguel and Patricia had come with us, and for the first time, Luna's two families were together in harmony. There was no longer competition or jealousy, just multiplied love. As I watched the planes take off and land, I thought about all the lives that had been touched by our story. The other children who had been rescued when the criminal network was exposed. The families who had found hope in our story. The mental health professionals who had learned new trauma treatment techniques working with Isabella and Luna. 10 years later, I found these letters on my desk this morning, one from Isabella and one from Luna, written to be opened on my 85th birthday. Isabella's letter. Dear Grandpa Eduardo, today I graduated from my doctorate program in trauma psychology. My thesis was on artificial neurological connections in victims of complex trauma. When I present it next week, I'm going to dedicate it to you, because you were the one who never stopped believing that impossible connections can be real. I now work at a treatment center for traumatized children, and every day I see the power of persistent hope. I tell our story to families who have lost their children, and I tell them that miracles are possible, but they require years of patient searching and unwavering love. I married last year to David, a social worker I met at university. He understands my story and respects the complexity of our family. We're expecting our first child, and we already know he'll be called Eduardo if it's a boy, Elena if it's a girl. Luna and I remain connected in ways scientists can't completely explain. We no longer live in the same city, but we still share dreams occasionally, and we always know when the other needs support. I want you to know that all the pain you suffered during those 12 years was redeemed by the love you created afterward. You're the reason our family exists in the beautiful and complicated way it exists now. I love you with all my soul. Isabella. Luna's letter. Dear Grandpa Eduardo, this year I opened my own business, an art studio where I work with children who have experienced trauma. I use art therapy techniques I developed based on my own experiences of expressing buried memories through drawing. I never became an academic like Isabella, but I found my own way to heal and help others. My artwork has been exhibited in galleries, and I always include a note that says, "For the grandfather who found me when I didn't know I was lost." Miguel walks me down the aisle next month when I marry Sarah, a teacher I met in one of my therapy groups. But I want you to know that in my heart, both Miguel and you are my fathers. Sarah understands this and says she feels lucky to be joining such a large and loving family. Isabella will be my maid of honor, of course. Sometimes people get confused because we're not twins but have such a strong connection. We explain that there are different types of sisterhood, and ours was created by extraordinary circumstances and persistent love. I want you to know that I've never felt like the abandoned girl since you found me at that airport. I feel like the girl who was searched for, found, and loved by more families than any person has a right to expect. I love you infinitely. Luna. As I read these letters on the porch of the house where Isabella and Luna now bring their own children to visit, I can't help but smile. My first airplane flight had been about fear of heights, but it had ended up being about the heights of love. Because I learned that true love isn't defined by genetics or biology. It's defined by persistence, by hope that stays alive even when all logic suggests it's time to give up, by the willingness to fly into the unknown when someone you love needs you. Isabella had been lost for 12 years, but had never stopped searching for the way home. Luna had been abandoned, but the universe had conspired to ensure she found not one family, but multiple families who would love her unconditionally. And I, a 72-year-old man who had never flown, had learned that sometimes you have to conquer your greatest fears to be able to receive the most incredible miracles. The flight of destiny had ended, but the family adventure it had begun would continue for generations. Because this is the truth about love. Once it's planted in good soil, it grows and multiplies in ways that defy all prediction, creating entire forests of connection and belonging where there was once only loneliness. And as I watch Isabella and Luna push their own children on the swings that Isabella once used, I know our story will continue to be told, inspiring other families to never lose hope, never stop searching, and never underestimate the power of love to create miracles at 30,000 feet. The end, because some stories don't end. They simply become the beginning of even more beautiful stories.